Well, good morning, everyone. Kingsley here. Welcome to our devotions this morning. And as you know, we're going through characters in the Bible, beginning with each of the letters of the alphabet. For some reason, we've got it wrong today because I've been given the letter H. And in North Yorkshire, the letter H doesn't exist. So if you're a Yorkshireman and you want to skip to tomorrow's one and miss me out, that's fine. My character's called Hagar, or you can just call her Hagar if you like. It's in Genesis chapter 21. And the passage here is about the disagreement between Sarah and Hagar. It was Sarah's idea that her husband Abraham would sleep with Hagar so that they would have a son that God had promised. But then Isaac was conceived, Isaac was born, and then Sarah hated Hagar and says to send her away. And so Abraham does, because God speaks to him. We take up the story in Genesis 21 and verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, put it on her shoulder. He gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down from him at a distance of about a bow shot, for she said to herself, "Let me not see the death of the boy." So she sat opposite him, lifted her voice and wept. God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." And then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. This is a passage really that's quite a disturbing one in many ways, but it maybe reflects on us where we are at this moment, coming through this pandemic, wondering sometimes where God is, and maybe we're wondering where we are. Hagar really in many ways was badly treated because it wasn't her idea to sleep with her master. It was Sarah's idea. And we see in an earlier chapter, in chapter 16, that she is sent away she runs away from Sarah after she gets pregnant, and God reveals himself as the God who sees. We see that in Genesis 16. But here in this chapter, I want to just pull a couple of things out for you this morning. And the first one is in verse 14. It says that she wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And that's almost an irony, because Beersheba means the well of the oath. It was the place where both Abraham and Isaac made a covenant with Abimelech of the Philistines, and then a covenant with God. In that place where they made a promise with God, and God promised himself to them. The well of the oath, it's a place that talks about the covenant and a promise. And yet she wanders in the middle of that place. And sometimes we can wander and find ourselves lost in the midst of the church. Maybe this morning you're wondering, where is God in my prayers? Where is he in when I'm trying to communicate with him? That's the first thing this morning. And she uses up the water and she sets her boy down. She sits at a distance and waited for him to die. But it says that she lifted her voice and wept in verse 16. In verse 17 it says, God heard the voice of the lad. Not her voice, but sure he did hear her voice, but he hears the voice of the lad and asks her what the problem is. And here's the phrase I want to leave with you this morning. It says that God heard the voice of the lad where, this is what God says, the angel says to her, God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Now listen to me this morning. God hears you where you are. Not where you want to be, where you think you ought to be, or even where God desires that you would eventually get to. God hears the voice of the lad. He hears your voice right where you are this morning, in the midst of your confusion, in the midst of your wandering, right out there in the wilderness of Beersheba. Wherever you are this morning, God hears you and he understands. And it says, he gives her instructions, says, arise. He opens her eyes in verse 19, and she saw a well of water right there in the wilderness. God opened up her eyes, and I pray for you this morning that God will open your eyes in the middle of your wilderness, and you'll find a well of water where you can draw from the resources and find that he is your supply this morning. So I love this Hagar woman, or Hagar, whatever you want to call her. She maybe was despised and confused and cast to one side, but in the midst of her wandering, in the midst of her not knowing where she was, she found God as the God who sees and the God who provides water in the midst of the wilderness. The God who sees you where you are, and God sees you where you are this morning. Father, I pray for each one of our people today, each one listening to the sound of my voice, that Lord, you will help them to realize that wherever they are today, at the beginning of this day, whether they feel blessed or whether they feel lost, that you're right with them, beside them, and you'll provide water in Jesus' name.